We're in Spain for the launch of a very special car. It's the new Aston Martin Vantage. This looks like a facelifted version of the old car, and I suppose technically it is on the outside. Up front is where it's most noticeably different. You had a much bigger grille, new headlights, they're inspired by the Aston Martin Valkyrie. This grille, while it does tie in with the other new Aston Martins, it also means much more airflow through. And why is that? That's because of the engine underneath. Elsewhere, the design changes aren't so obvious. Around the side there's some detail changes, mostly in the name of performance and aerodynamics and not style, and the same thing around the rear. This has always been one of my favourite views of the car, so I'm kind of quite happy they haven't changed too much. Before we get in and show you the key part of the car, which is the interior, I will tell you that first of all we're going to go out and drive it on the road, then we're going to come back here and spend a little bit of time on the track, and I'll talk you through what it's like in both those situations. Now, the most important part of this car, I reckon, and the engineers will probably disagree with me, is the interior. So let's have a look. Now, the Aston Martin Vantage of old, we absolutely loved, but you almost had to make an excuse for it because of the interior. You used a lot of old Mercedes bits and pieces, and while it was functional enough, it probably didn't represent the Aston Martin brand. Now, that's all change, and the interior is actually a highlight of the new Vantage. We saw it before, it came from the DB12, or DB12 was the first new Aston Martin to feature this interior, but it doesn't make it any less special. Where does it start? It starts with digital instruments in front of me. They're customizable, loads of different views. It's got a nice big touchscreen here in the middle, great infotainment, you got Apple CarPlay, all works very seamlessly. Thankfully, very happy to see Aston Martin realise that we want physical controls too. So below that is actually key to this car. You've got in the middle this kind of dry select nub for the gear selector, and it's really solid, very well engineered. And ahead of that is rotary. Now, in some cars you might expect that to be for the touchscreen, but for this, it's the start button in the middle, the engine start button, and you twist it, and that's for the drive modes. And it takes some force to twist it, it's so solid. It's very, very satisfying to use. Either side of that, you've got these lovely knurled knobs too, there for the cabin temperature, fan speed, and the volume actually for the stereo itself, and extra buttons around here for the various driving controls. I'll talk about them when we're out and about. Elsewhere, as before, the size of the car hasn't changed, so no surprise there that it's still a two-seat cabin. There is plenty of space for two, plenty of adjustment in the seat and in the wheel and the seat itself. The wheel itself is new too, that comes from the DB12. It's not quite fully circular, a little bit of flat at the bottom. We'll forgive Aston Martin that because it's got a perfectly proportioned rim. The paddles for the gears are now behind the steering wheel itself and not in the column, and they're these lovely, delicious metal things, so you'll want to use them, not just to hear the engine, but also because they're nice to touch. As ever in an Aston Martin, the interior, you know, how you specify it is as endless or as high as your budget really. There's a huge amount of customization and personalization available to it. This particular car has really nice bucket seats, they hold you well, they look good, and yet they're also decent over a long journey. Now, forget about any of that now. Told you, the interior is fabulous. Let's go see what it's like to drive. We spent the first couple of hours of the day at the Aston Martin Vantage launch on the road, so really challenging, variable country roads here in Spain. Pretty empty, very variable surface actually, so you've got some of this rough tarmac that's really quite broken, and the wide Michelin tyres really pick up on that, and there's a bit of coarseness there. But what we've discovered in the sport mode, which is the standard, the default driving mode, it isn't massively uncomfortable, even over bumps and everything. It rides them pretty well, deals with it very, very well indeed. Now, Aston Martin is using a new damper system, and it says it has 500% wider operating bandwidth, which is actually quite some claim. And what that means, of course, is that at one end it's softer and at the other end it's firmer. And you certainly notice that as you move up through the driving mode, so Sport Plus and Track. There are also individual and wet modes, which obviously individual is for customization, wet is for wet weather, which thankfully we're not testing today. There isn't a huge difference in the damping I found on the road between Sport and Sport Plus, but the engine response certainly ramps up in Sport Plus mode. The steering is a little bit different, and the car does certainly feel a bit more urgent. It also, you have this exhaust button down here. If you have that pressed, you get a much louder soundtrack and a lot more popping and banging, although it doesn't sound superfluous. It sounds very full of intent and meaning, and it just sounds real, I guess, and that's quite a nice thing. You can't go too far wrong, of course, with a twin turbocharged 4-litre V8 under the bonnet, and for this update, Aston Martin has enacted a serious upgrade of that engine. As before, it's a Mercedes-AMG unit, but Aston Martin gets to work on it itself, and now this car has up to 665 horsepower and 800 Newton meters, which is just a phenomenal set of figures. Yet it doesn't feel undrivable on the road. It doesn't feel like that's too much for the car, so all the chassis changes, and there have been a lot, clearly help with that and make it a very drivable car. And key thing, it's drivable at normal speeds. Bolted to that V8 engine is the 8-speed ZF automatic gearbox as before. It's mounted at the back actually, so this car has got 50-50 weight distribution, which is nice. And it feels that when you're driving it around. It feels agile, it feels biddable, it feels like you can rotate it, slide the back a little bit if you really wanted to, but it's competent and stable at the same time. And that's quite a good achievement. One of the key things Aston Martin did with the chassis is increase stiffness, and while what's called global stiffness, overall stiffness of the car has increased, also Aston Martin has increased the stiffness of the mounting points of the suspension, and that just helps the car be a bit more precise, and it goes where you expect it to, where you want it to. At the end of the day, it just means a more rewarding driving experience. Underpinning and controlling all of these subsystems is probably one of the most clever parts of the car that we don't see. There's something called a 6D accelerometer, so 6-dimensional accelerometer if you like, and that data feeds into the control systems for the rest of the car, and it means it's very, very quick to react to situations and very, very adaptive. So it just overall means it does things better without the driver noticing, and yet still allows the driver to feel like they're part of the process. And while Aston Martin has clearly put a lot of engineering effort into how this car drives, I'd suggest that the interior revamp is probably just as important as all that. It is, after all, the part of the car that you touch and you feel and you see all the time. You sit in it, and it is transformed. It's got the new infotainment system from the DB12, the Aston Martin DB12, as we've seen already, and it just feels way better. It feels more modern. It's way better quality to touch and everything. The operation is far more modern. Thankfully, despite the fact that we've got digital instruments, a big touchscreen in the middle, Aston Martin has retained physical controls. Now, this is something it did with the DB12, it's carried on at the DBX 707, and it's also here. So you've got these really chunky, solid metal physical switchgear in the center here. In the middle is the drive mode controller, and it's unbelievably solid, actually, really surprising. Behind that, you've got the drive selector, which again is a solidly moving nub, if you like. And then either side, you've got temperature and fan controls, and then some controls for the actual stereo as well. In between all that, you got actual buttons for some of the subsystems. So you can turn on and off the louder exhaust if you wish. You can actually disable the firmer damping if you want as well. There's a button there, or enable it if you're in the sport mode. And then the traction control. Traction control is an interesting one. You hold down this traction control button here, and it pops up on the screen here that you can vary the traction control. And so you turn the dial, the drive mode selector, to choose between 1 and 9, and you can choose which you prefer. What I really like is that once you've done that, you can very, very quickly tweak it. So say you're on the track, which is, let's face it, where you should only be playing with such things properly. Wet track to start with, you're learning the track. You might keep the traction control at a lower level, at a level where it's controlling the traction a bit more. But then when you come to a favorite corner and you want to have a bit of fun, and you're going to maybe learn how to drift a little bit, you can change the traction control just immediately. Just turn this quick dial and it changes the level of traction control intervention. I think that's really good touch, and I think it'll be enjoyed by the car's owners as well, as they get to learn the car on track. Now, speaking of track, the only place to test this car is a track, so let's see what it can really do. do. As you can hear, we are now on track in the Aston Martin Vantage. And if you can't enjoy days at work like this, what can you enjoy? It is immense. And why wouldn't it be? Twin turbocharged, 4-litre V8, 665 horsepower, 800 newton meters of torque, rear wheel drive. So much fun. It's worth pointing out that this isn't a track special. In fact, it's not really a track focused car, but to come to a track, to experience it, what it can do, you know, to be able to safely push it to the limit here is such an experience. It really is such a special car. And I guess one thing that really stands out is that how special the engine, how key the engine is to that experience. Let's calm down and try and talk a bit more objectively. This is where the track mode comes into play. It adjusts lots of things. It adjusts the damping, the steering, the throttle response, the action of the differential at the rear, the transmission, and it all comes together as something that's just massively engaging and huge fun. The Vantage, as before, has a relatively short wheelbase, so it's a very agile car, and hence it can rotate around its axis very quickly. And that's something that Aston Martin wanted to retain in the new version, while maybe make it a bit more stable. And on the road it was very stable, notably so. It didn't feel like it was getting out of shape, and yet it's still a lot of fun. Here on the track, where you have a bit more space to play with, you can get it out of shape if you want to. Catching it perhaps may take a little bit more skill and a bit of practice, but that variable traction control I mentioned earlier really comes into its own here. It allows you to play with it, allows you to learn the car, learn a track, learn the limits of adhesion, and then, you know, as you improve, as the track improves, you can dial back the traction control a little bit more. I'm in the Sport Plus mode right now, and you can hear it, noise it makes. So I'm going to dial it up into the full-on track mode next. And I've actually got the traction control on, so you need to press the traction control button once to take that off, then turn the dial up here into the track mode. That's good. You can see the tracker flag symbol up here. I've got manual mode in the transmission set because it's more rewarding to use these fantastic metal paddles behind the wheel here. And the last thing I want to do is just double check that the variable traction control is doing its thing. You can press the ESC button once to go into an ESC track mode, and that just leaves a little bit more slip and a little bit more sliding, if you like, before the car cuts in and helps you, but it's still got the safety net of stability control. If you hold down that button, that's how you access the variable traction control, and that's what I'm going to do now. I'm on the big long straight here, so I've got a few seconds to hold that down, and that's come on. It's a very warm day, there's lots of traction, lots of space to play. On this straight, interestingly, we're hitting nearly 270 kilometers an hour before hard braking for the right down here. Getting the apex in this first corner is actually kind of tricky. See how easy you can slide there. You can hear the squeal of the tires. It's very controllable. It does telegraph it really well. I think the difficulty with a short wheelbase car like this is make sure you don't leave it go too far and stop it going snapping back the other way. These faster corners still got tons of grip from these Michelin tires. And you've got a nice fast direction change here. It's like a chicane, if you like. It's some curves so you can hear, which is deeply satisfying. You know, a normal driver to jump over the curves like a race car driver does, I guess. And this hairpin is where a lot of fun can be had. So there you go. That's a track drive of the new Vantage, and as I said, it's a fabulous opportunity to see what it can do without the confines of speed limits and road safety, and it is just so much fun. It doesn't actually matter how fast it is in terms of lap times. It's just engaging, enjoyable. It makes you feel alive. The noise of that engine, the engagement, the steering, the brakes, the whole package. It's all built for engagement, and this is a car that you'll want to keep forever. Now, if you forgive me, I'm not going to drive. Well, as you might have been able to tell, I enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. And that is what this car is all about. I know we banged on about the extra power, the extra torque, the extra performance, the extra torsional stiffness, all of that. Actually, none of that matters. All that matters is how it makes you feel. And this car makes you feel special. It is an occasion, whether you're driving it on the road, driving it on the track, anything in between. Long may it last. None of that you wouldn't have said mostly about the old Vantage. Now, it also has an interior to match the brand. And if this is the sign of more things to come from Aston Martin, we cannot wait to spend more days like this. Well, that's our review of the new Aston Martin Vantage. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed making it. Probably not. Anyway, if you want to read about the car and all of its rivals, pop along to the website. It's CompleteCar.ie, and it's a great resource for researching your next new car.